Welcome to this episode of The People Dividend. I'm Mike Horne, your host, and I'm delighted to have in our virtual studio today Rhonda Moret. And she's got a fascinating background. We're going to talk a lot about elevated diversity. We'll talk some about elevated health equity. But she is a first generation college graduate. She began her career working as at a multicultural ad agency in Los Angeles and on several counts targeting traditionally marginalized populations. She's had a 20 plus year career as a communications strategist for some of the world's most recognized brands, including Universal, Nike Golf, the PGA of America, the PGA Tour, where she's created communications and outreach campaigns. Was in her career consistently the only woman and the only person of color. And despite her proactive efforts, navigating the environment proved challenging for her at times. So she's put all this to good use. She's put it into her business. She founded a company called Elevated Diversity in 2017, which enables industry leaders to chart their unique DEI ethos by developing practices and strategies designed for real organizational impact. So today, due to her customized approach, her company's clients include reputable organizations such as the Berkeley Symphony, Boston Beer, Homeland Security, as well as the Alameda Alliance for Health, American Academy of Physicians Assistants, Life Circles, Island Health, among others. She's a trailblazing figure, a thought leader in diversity, equity, inclusion, and health equity. So with all that said, I'm so delighted, Rhonda, that you're here. And why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Thanks so much, Mike. That was I appreciate the introduction. You covered a lot of ground there. There's several years, but yeah, as you noted, I started my my career in a communications capacity. I totally fell into this job and fell into to love what would become my profession for many years. Took some of that experience, some of those the good and the bad that I saw with working with different organizations, and decided to create elevated diversity, and we did that based on our fact of just wanting to help organizations create much more inclusive workplaces where folks didn't feel marginalized or feel like they were on the fringe, as I often did. I spent many years working in the golf industry, and to your point, inevitably, I was the only woman of color who had a seat at the table. So I wanted to see what we could do to increase that. So that's what we've been doing. We started the company about 7 years ago, so we are still going strong.
It's so interesting to me. I mean, one of your topics of expertise is why diversity is not a dirty word. And I
Mhm.
want to relate to the audience an experience I recently had. I'm getting ready to release my next book in October. It's going to be by the same title as the podcast, The People Dividend. It's really uncovers leadership strategies for unlocking employee potential. So, in all of the pre work and pre marketing that we've been doing for the People Dividend, Leadership Strategies for Unlocking Employee Potential, I've been writing a lot for different media outlets, some of which have featured me in the past: Psychology Today, HR.com, lots of publications.
Mhm.
And in some recent feedback that I've had, uh, people have told me, stay away from the topic of diversity.
Mhm.
It's not selling as well.
Mhm.
What do you have you experienced any of that, or what do you think about that,
I
Rhonda?
have experienced that, and unfortunately, I find it. First off, I'll address it from a personal level. I find it
Yeah,
incredibly disheartening because I think at its very core, DEI work um, could mean some really good things for a lot of folks who simply haven't had the opportunities in the past. So that's my personal take on it. But from a professional vantage point, I see. it as being the next evolution. And I always like to use the example of initially it was diversity and inclusion. So everyone was calling it DNI. And then we came to DEI. So we added that equity in there. And so that was another evolution. Now we're also seeing organizations that are recognizing, hey, we need to make sure that we're accessible, right? So you see DEIA and you also see DEIB for belonging. So I do see it as an evolution. I also see it as an attempt to somewhat mainstream DEI. So it wasn't focused on one particular group or segment of the population. I think with the term itself, diversity, you hear diversity, and what do you think? Often we think in terms of black and white. So it became very racial. And unfortunately, it became a racially charged topic in many workplaces. So moving away, evolving away from that term in particular, and leaning into inclusion, what we call being much more inclusion forward, is where we're seeing the industry go and some of the work that we're doing. Although we've always leaned into being inclusive, because there's too many of these marginalized groups that really need to have a voice. It's not just from a racial perspective, but looking at various other diversity dimensions that are often overlooked. So,
Yeah, sometimes I wonder about the increasing polarization. I'm going to just bring this back to a U.S. focus.
mhm,
I think about the current political environment, and I think there's half of the people who think this way and half of the people who think another way.
right.
And it seems so polarizing in so many ways. And I've always been a big believer in what two of my colleagues, Fred Miller and Judith Katz, who wrote a book called The Inclusion Breakthrough 30 years ago,
Mhm,
that, most of it begins, our oldest and greatest technology to encourage diversity and inclusion is to say hello to someone.
right.
I've always found it works out really well, to acknowledge another person. But what do you think about all that? I mean, and how are we coming to terms with this, given what I perceive as some increasing polarization of ideas and energy, at least in our domestic scene?
I think it's very interesting that the book that you noted is 30 years old. And I think it as a fine example of how this has always been a struggle, is how do we get people in the workplace to actually connect and form these relationships and bonds that we need in order to have a highly engaged and highly productive workforce. So I mean, I feel like this is part of the evolution. There definitely is some polarization, and there definitely is some politics that's involved. And I think organizations and many of our clients are taking a fresh look at their DEI stance and figuring out, okay, what does this look like for our organization moving forward? Is it simply a name change? Is it based on what the label is of this effort? Or is it something a bit more foundational? Do they need to have some new programming, which I'm hearing as well? So I think for each organization, and again, I've experienced this daily as of late. Organizations are just taking a step back and reevaluating. And I also hear that, hey, with politics and the election, we're going to kind of see how it plays out, which is, I think, it's kind of surprising that politics and that component or that element of our society has really been seeping into the workplace.
I think it's so interesting, to explore this topic with you about charting a path forward for DEIB. And I think about some of the work that I did now 20 years ago with big corporations as a diversity and inclusion consultant, whether it was at Darden Restaurants, where we helped create the most diverse board of a Fortune 250. Whether it was at Office Depot, where we were really working at all kinds of things. Our issues at that time, were about gender, about race, and about ability,
Mhm.
physical ability. The spectrum keeps growing broader, I think, for folks. And I wonder, how do you think about that in terms of charting this path forward for DEIB?
In terms of making sure that we do reach all the what we consider our
Yes.
diversity dimensions, incredibly
Yes.
critical. I mean, it's critical.
Yeah.
One of the areas that we've started to do more work with is disability awareness, because that's one of the largest marginalized communities out of them all, and it's just so much of it is just a lack of awareness, and that's where these types of DEI programs, regardless of what you want to call them or label them, they're incredibly important to be able to provide knowledge and create awareness. So then again, we are able to work together much more cohesively as a team with that heightened awareness, and just creating a culture of a growth mindset where people take interest in others who may look different, sound different, have different life choices or life experiences. But DEI, and I love the fact that you share that you've been doing this work for so many years. It's always been about, how do we connect people? It's not like, oh, we want to give this group this and provide that group this other benefit. No, it's how do we create a much more equitable and inclusive workplace. And somewhere along the way we kind of got off track. And I see, definitely I see the good and the bad. I've seen some things that I think the some DEI practitioners maybe should have done differently or rethought the approach. But there's been good and bad on both sides. But I think now is the time to really reevaluate and not throw the baby out with the bad bathwater, but realize, hey, there is some really good stuff here. How do we build upon it?
Yeah, how do we create this clarion call for, a renewed emphasis, a renewed focus on DEIB in organizations? Because, I think in some ways, to my comments earlier, um, there's some reluctance now. There is some, you, you know, let's pay a little less attention to this. Um, how do we reignite this, particularly in
Yeah,
our corporate environments?
yeah, I think that is a really good question. I do think, and this is what intrigued me even before I started the firm, is just looking at research. So whether it's Deloitte or McKinsey or any other of the those types of organizations who have put forth just volumes of research and data points that show having a diverse work team, it's just makes good business sense. Whether it's from financial performance, engagement, I mean, the innovation, the list goes on. Those teams, and I think it just makes sense. So if you have a boardroom of people who all look the same or who have all had the same life experience, or uh, so on and so forth, you're going to have a lot of the same groupthink. But wouldn't it be nice to have some different perspectives and different viewpoints? To that point, we also know, according to the US Census Bureau, by 2040, we will no longer have a white majority. So it's just a statistic that whether it's 2040 or 2041 or 20, whatever, that's going to happen. So, how do we make sure that as leaders, we are prepared to lead a workforce that may look different than I do, or may look different than the person next door? Those leaders need to be inclusive leaders and have the skills and the competency to be able to be effective in that role.
It's interesting. I mean, fully acknowledging, I primarily work a lot in California. Many of my clients are in California
Mhm,
or on the East Coast,
mhm,
Massachusetts,
mhm.
New York. Uh, s- there's racism, there's ageism, there's sexism in those places,
Sure.
East and West.
Right.
And I don't do a lot of work in the middle.
Right.
And I wonder, I mean, in your experience, is it different? I mean, because I see diversity all around me in
Right.
California.
Right.
I look, that's, in some ways, that's probably not true
Mhm.
because certainly in leadership ranks, I mean, it continues to be a lot
Right.
of white men.
Right.
But I wonder, like, what else is going on?
Yeah, and we're based in Southern California. We have the majority of our clients are on the East or West Coast. However, I will share with you that I've got some clients, a few in Ohio and a few in Michigan. And these organizations are on the healthcare side. They're smaller organizations, um, and they're actually all white women in leadership. And I love the fact that they raised their hand and they said, "We don't know what we don't know, so we are here to learn." So they were open to learning new things again of how to work with individuals from different backgrounds and different diversity spectrums. And also, they want to know, okay, what does this look like? How can we keep this growth mindset? And what can we learn more about the LGBTQ plus community or those with disabilities or so on and so forth? So I really always am somewhat over the moon when I do get clients like that because they are raising their hands and saying, "Okay, we want to learn." And that's where I think a lot of this momentum will continue. The other thing that I was going to share with you is that I think another big component is that younger generation. So tomorrow's leaders, they are so much more in tune with looking at things from a much more inclusive lens. They are much more willing to say, have curiosity about others from different backgrounds than their own. So I think as time progresses and as that younger generation, as they begin leading those organizations, we are going to continue to see this work carry on. And
Yeah.
again, it might have a different name or different label, but the essence of the work, I think, will continue to be there.
Yeah, so important, isn't it, that we do this? And one of the things I always talk about is being able to bring who you are to what you do, being able to bring your best to every situation. And on my website, there are a couple of ebooks that people can download that will help with these, create reflection on these topics about bringing more of who you are to what you do, which I think is so important. And for you, how do you gauge progress on DEI initiatives in organizations or in the client systems that you work in?
Yeah, not unlike any type of effective learning and development programs, we time taking those steps because we know we need to validate and be able to show that yeah we are moving the needle. So we take those types of steps, but we also there's a client. That we had started working with a few years ago. And their problem was one of optics. So everyone within their organization was a white female, and there was 100 plus white females, and they realized, hey, this isn't helping to grow our business if someone comes to our website and it's a sea of sameness, and if you don't fit that mold, then there's a problem. But they've been able to, with some modifications and some really strategic moves on their part, and readjusting how they view things, and whether it's modifications to some policies, practices, and procedures, BIPOC. And so we're seeing that evolve because they were able to look at a situation within the organization and say, you know what, something just isn't right. And a lot of times, I think one of the big hurdles within an organization is for that leadership team to look at the organization, look at those practices, policies, and procedures, and say, is that so it is a bit more equitable? And again, I think we're seeing that evolve as well with new policies, whether it's for parental leave being extended to fathers, that type of thing. I think will continue to flourish.
That's great. And, as people think about it, how do we really master these difficult DEI conversations in organizations?
Well, we always like to say that DEI it's a competency. I mean, so it's not anything that we are born with. We certainly didn't study it in school, and those lofty MBA programs, they don't teach it. So it's something, those difficult conversations, and we've done a lot of those types of training programs because it is developing that skill. It takes experiential learning. So we do a lot of role playing and put people into those situations so that with that practice, when they are in the workplace and they encounter that they are a bit more equipped, and they feel a bit more confident. Hey, I can engage in this type of dialogue. It goes a long way versus just shying away from a situation and not addressing it at all.
Hey, that's great. And I just, one last question, in terms of your topics of expertise is, what do most people get wrong about DEI?
Well, I think that circles back to
Yeah.
where we started, right? Diversity is a dirty word. No, diversity, number one, is not simply along color lines and a black-white issue, but it covers all of us. So whether we're women, whether we're an older demographic, so on and so forth. So it really is looking at the totality of these diversity dimensions and finding ways to accommodate people, to your point, so that they feel like they can show up authentically at the workplace, and be prepared to do their best work.
Rhonda, it's been great having you as a guest on the People Dividend. I want to, it'll be in the show notes, but I want to encourage people to visit you on LinkedIn at Rhonda Moret, RhondaMoret, or certainly at elevateddiversity.com, where you can learn more about Rhonda and her team and all the great work they're doing at Elevated Diversity and Elevated Health Equity. So again, Rhonda, thank you so much for being a guest today. I really enjoyed it. And until the next episode of the People Dividend, stay well.